Measuring podcast downloads can be a giant mystery. Like, the more you dig into them, the less you may find. So let's explore why this is the case and what you can do to find the most accurate numbers for your podcast. Hello, my name is George Weiner. I'm the chief whaler of Whole Whale, a social impact digital agency. We also happen to have a podcast, and we use that to figure out how to measure podcast downloads. Yeah, to start with the numbers, podcasting is huge, right? Like 70% of the US population is familiar with the term podcasting, and 51% or 144 million of the US population has listened to a podcast, and that's from 2018 according to the Infinite Dial 2019 reporting. The most attractive aspect of the medium is how intimate the relationship can be with your audience. Podcasting is a unique channel in the world. Where it's becoming harder and harder to keep someone's attention, podcasting is keeping that attention. So if you're gonna pour the amount of work necessary into creating a podcast, you're gonna wanna measure its success. But how? Here are some of the engagement metrics we can kind of look for across platforms. Total downloads over time, monthly or daily downloads, downloads by episode, unique users, downloads/subscribers, embedded player views, podcast website traffic, iTunes reviews, calculated iTunes numbers, subscribers across Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, and other native platform follows. Okay, but why is it so hard to measure all of this stuff and who listens? Podcasting is a decentralized medium. The point of consumption happens across different devices and platforms. A podcast feed is just basically a page of code with a list of information about your podcast, titles, descriptions, and that link to the MP3 file audio. Well, this feed can then be picked up by any podcast player and network, and it allows people to listen to these MP3 files on wherever they happen to be. Once the file is downloaded by a user's device, well, your ability to track what they do with that file kind of falls off the cliff. Imagine you were in the 90s and gave out CDs with your podcast audio on it in each episode, and then try to figure out who actually listened to that CD. Well, trying to track podcasts is kind of similar. We can track the total downloads, and we can tell if those downloads were from a unique device, but that's kind of where the measurement trail meets the edge of that cliff. How do I track my Apple Podcasts and overall subscribers? Gosh, shouldn't this just be a number I can look up on the back end of Apple Podcasts once I set up my feed? Well, as of 2019 and the end of 2019, there are no retroactive data. So Apple iTunes Connect has podcast analytics for feeds and hosted on the platform. The interface is designed well, but sadly, it still doesn't just show that subscriber number. iTunes Podcast Analytics. So, well, the answer is you can't really tell Apple Podcast subscribers with 100% accuracy. But before you feel bad about the data, note that these numbers are only from devices that use Apple Podcast app. So this is what allows them to show cool things like the amount of actual time devices spend listening to the podcast. However, they aren't showing data from users that actually use podcast apps like Stitcher, Google, Pocket Casts, or Spotify. In order to find subscribers, you need to have a third-party hosting service like a PodTrack or a Podbean. A service like this will help you track unique downloads by client and device, and that uses the Apple Podcast library. Once you have this third-party tracking, it is possible to look up how many unique feed hits, unique IP downloads you get from an iTunes Apple device, right? So then you need to act under the assumption that these are devices that are subscribed to your feed, automatically pinging the feed. A little complicated. In this image, we have selected the feed hits by the source iTunes, which then gives us the overall quarterly data, screenshot from PodTrack here. Based on this rolling quarterly number, we can take the last full quarter of, say, Q1 2015 across platforms, giving us 276 as an approximate number of Apple Podcasts. Gosh, it should be noted though that this is a relative proxy that is almost certainly underreporting. As you can see, the purple region nearly is 50% of download activity. It's not actively tracked? Well, we can cross-check these numbers by using another tracking platform that we have set up for Whole Whale through Podbean. So podcast analytics example here is to look at this data snapshot from Podbean. For the same podcast, we can then see that there are 285 iOS unique platform downloads, which matches up closely with that PodTrack 276 number. This view shows us other platforms downloading the podcast, and Android platforms become more popular. You can quickly see that just measuring Apple network success doesn't give you that full picture, especially when you realize 40 to 50% of your data are not available. Yeah, I get it. So what is the best way to track a podcast? Well, if you are creating a podcast and you care about tracking, well, you should choose a professional podcasting host like a Podbean or Libsyn that simplifies the tracking setup. If you want to get a bit fancier though, you can run that hosting on a platform, but build your podcast feed through an own platform like a WordPress podcasting plugin, which will give you a bit more control over tracking. For our Whole Whale podcast, we went, well, guess what? A little overboard because we're geeks. Here's our current internal configuration. We host our podcast on Podbean. However, we build the feed through WordPress, Serious Simple Podcasting's plugin. We create posts for each podcast episode, embed the Podbean player there, redirect the download URL for the feed podcast through the website, triggering a Google Analytics event. This then sends the request through podtrack.com. The feed was then submitted to iTunes Connect and the Stitcher and other publisher portals. To be clear, this is overkill. However, it's helped us understand that even when we go crazy trying to measure things, we're still a bit in the dark. None of these tools gives us 100% accuracy to our listeners. Rather, just a benchmark to try to build on. Even if we can only see 50% of our activity, we can still set goals on increasing the predictive outputs that we can see. I guess if it were easy, everyone would do it. Remember, just because something is difficult to measure doesn't mean it isn't worth doing. As content platforms and devices become more diverse, it is a good idea to make sure you can follow your audience. We love podcasting because, again, it's an intimate communication medium and a chance to really talk with people that we want to hear their thoughts and what they have to say. Additional podcasting, hosting, and tracking resources for you. Anchor, love this one. Free hosting, podcast creation, and analytics tool. Podbean, hosting and tracking. Libsyn, hosting and tracking as well. Blurberry.com, hosting and tracking. MyPodcastReviews.com aggregates and sends your podcast reviews to you. SoundCloud.com, a great embedding system for podcasts on your website. RawVoice.com, raw audio hosting with analytics. PodTrack is podcast tracking services for that. Google Analytics podcast events is a little complex to implement, as we mentioned before in our feed. Stitcher.com is a publisher portal. Whew. Hope that was helpful. You know what? Give our podcast a listen actually at wholewhale.com/podcast. Also, please subscribe to our channel so you can keep up with our latest content. It'll be great. Trust me.